Hello, and happy Black History Month. I'm Anthony Pegues, VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Justice here at Defenders of Wildlife. And I just want to say thanks for joining us to celebrate and acknowledge this special time of year where we illuminate the efforts, the achievements, and challenges of African Americans in conservation. I want to extend a warm welcome to all our guests that have joined us today and say hello to my fellow staff members that are here as well. DEIJ is important to the mission of Defenders as we continue to amplify the voices of and increase representation of marginalized communities and conservation. Defenders is ensuring that DEIJ is at the core of all of what we do, and this webinar that was spearheaded by members of our Texas office, Azalea and Sherry, and supported by their fellow Observance Day Committee members, and members of various departments across Defenders is just one of the ways we are making sure that we move the DEIJ needle forward. Since our Texas office opened in 2018, and they have hit the ground running, and its team members have worked diligently to bring diverse voices of Texas to us in a 3-part webinar. Today is number 2. These webinars will feature dynamic speakers that will show how diversity is being implemented in conservation efforts in Texas and how these efforts can be used across the country. Moderating these events is David Smallwood. Our moderator's work at the Dallas Zoo as a conservation interpreter gives him the opportunity to do 2 of the things he loves most, talking and engaging people on meaningful topics. He often says that he will talk about conservation at the drop of a hat and is usually the one to drop that hat. Being one of the faces of education and community impact at the zoo is one of his greatest joys. So I hope that you are ready to be enlightened by our today's presentation, and make sure you jot down all your questions for the Q&A. And on behalf of Defenders of Wildlife, again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. And to see what else Defenders is doing, check us out at defenders.org. So without any further ado, and never want to pass up the opportunity to represent, please welcome Mr. David Smallwood. Mr. Smallwood, all yours.
Thanks, Anthony. All right. Happy Black History Month, everybody. And like Anthony said, I'm a conservation interpreter at Dallas Zoo. Actually, I've recently been promoted now. So I'm Assistant Supervisor of Education, David Smallwood, at the Dallas Zoo. And you come here on a Tuesday through a Saturday, chances are you will run into me and I will talk to you about a lot of things. I will talk to you about anything pertaining to animals, conservation, and how you can help. It's one of my joys in life. And speaking of all these things, I'm super stoked to introduce you to our speaker today. She has a she's a PhD student in environmental science at the University of North Texas. Her graduate work focuses on the disparities in access to conservation, education, and nature amongst Black and low economic students, in Texas, and the collection and preservation of Black ecological knowledge. Oh, yeah. During her undergraduate degree, she utilized camera traps to build a photographic archive of animals living in the Trinity River Audubon Center. During her time at the Audubon Center, she hosted groups of volunteers, led hikes, and engaged in conversations related to conservation, education, and Blackness in their environment. She is a children's book author, educated, and lifelong learner, and my new best friend, Krystal Toney. All right, Krystal, it's all yours. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, everybody. So I want to first say good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today. And, I'm truly honored to be able to kind of share my story and share this testimony. I love sharing stories. It's kind of my thing, especially since I've gotten into environmental science, learning that narratives are very powerful. And to be able to do it this month during Black History Month, such a powerful month to be able to share these stories in this environment amongst like-minded individuals, right? So today I'm going to be telling a story about my great-grandmother's garden. Really, it's a story about healing and conservation. And what it does is it encompasses this concept that we as a people are capable of healing with and through the land. And as an environmentalist, I understand that when I'm sitting in class and I'm talking to my professor and I talk about conservation in this way, it's not always accepted wholeheartedly, but After my research and looking back on it, I understand how much of who I am today is based on my great grandmother's garden. And unfortunately, these types of stories aren't brought into classrooms, and they do so much to inspire conservation work. Like they're imperative. It's kind of how I feel about it. So when thinking about this thing, it's kind of obvious, right, that the layout of America's history has been largely dependent kind of upon the uprooting, not only of trees, right, and not, just destroying ecosystems, but also Black folks, right? It's kind of dependent on destroying Black culture, silencing Black stories, ending Black lives. So often, when I'm sitting in my environmental science building where I am right now, amongst my white peers, I'm asked, what does your Black life have to do with conservation and environmental science? And often when I answer them, I say everything, right? They don't like that answer, but that's the answer, everything. So before I get into it, what I always like to do is define the term of healing, because I understand that healing has many definitions. From my ancestors, and a doctor might have different definitions of what healing encompasses. So I like to talk about it a little bit. And when I talk about healing, I'm specifically referring to broken connections, right? And these connections could have been severed due to enslavement of ancestors, socioeconomic issues related to cultural identity. The list really is individualized and based upon individual experiences and perspectives. And when we talk about healing, we're referring to reestablishing those connections, right? Rebuilding relationships, finding new ways to tend to old wounds is a good way that I like to say it. And just trying to find ways that are to benefit community and self, right? This healing requires us to look inwards and outwards, to look at others as well as ourselves, to consider others as well as ourselves, to consider the community as well as our research, not just one or the other. And, it comes in many forms, right? There's spiritual healing, there's cultural healing, there's healing physically and mentally. And as a scientist and as a Black woman, I often talk about the importance of healing in order to do my research. If you are not a healed individual spiritually, if you're not individually healed, how can you pursue your research? What does it look like going into a community dealing with the travesties of, ecosystem degradation and everything, if you haven't dealt with the internal things that you need to deal with? So I really stress about what healing is and healing in our environments, because we always talk about restoring ecosystems and rebuilding habitats. And, we can't forget to do those things for ourselves, right? And y'all, I love this book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. And whenever I think about healing and reconnecting, one thing I've really been connecting with lately is Jarvis Gibbons' book on Fugitive Pedagogy. And, I highly recommend it if you're into this and you're doing this type of work. And I thought it was super appropriate considering it's Carter G. Woodson. But, this has really been one of the frameworks that is really driving force behind the work that I'm currently doing in conservation and education. But the one thing I always point out in the book is when Gibbon makes this statement, and he says that the violent assault on the Black life begins in the classroom. And I think of how Black children and Hispanic children, are more likely to develop asthma, regardless of income. I think about how Black folks over the age of 65 are more likely to die from pollution and other related illnesses than their white counterparts. And I have to stop and wonder if that assault also, just starts in the womb. Before we even step foot into the classroom. As an environmentalist, I'm thinking about, what has this, the assault on the Black life started? And it really is a question that just leaves me in awe and wonder constantly, trying to figure that out. And I also think of my grandparents. I lost both of my great grandparents to cancer. I lost my grandfather to cancer. I have relatives now. I have a relative now who is currently fighting cancer. And this just brings me to question all the time, like, what would life be like? How could things be different? And while I can't tell all of their stories today, I have come to tell one. And that's her. That's my great grandma, y'all. That's her name was Thelma Lee, but everybody called her Ma. It was short for mother. She was the mother of the church, and she was the Ma of the neighborhood. And she was a very spiritual person, and she saw the world through a complex lens that would take me several college degrees, right, to truly appreciate and embrace. She didn't consider herself to be a scientist. She didn't care about Darwin. She didn't care about what Jane Goodall had to say. She never finished school. She never went to college, but she also never stopped learning. She never stopped writing. She never stopped observing. She never stopped questioning and experimenting. And it was this nature in her that really really pushed her to become closer to the environment, because she would always tell me, this is a part of us and it's important that we respect her. And she would always refer to it as her. We always respect her in the same way we want to be respected, always. Boom. So my great grandmother, she grew up on a pig farm, y'all, in Texas, right here in Texas. And the pig farm was actually one of her fondest memories from her childhood, and that she often shared with me, right? And her mother and father, they were both pig farmers here. We were living during very different times. They were able to pay their bills. They were able to make ends meet. They were able to support their lifestyle with the pig farm. It was very suitable. But eventually the world began to change. The world changed around them. And urbanization began to set in, and human society began to look different, operate differently. You could no longer go down the street and exchange things for clothes, right? Everybody's not looking for pigs from your farm because they have grocery stores, right? They're going to grocery stores, they're getting all these little things they need, and they're bringing them back home. So a pig farm was no longer, a sustainable way of life at that time. And slowly they began to lose their grip on their farm. And my grandmother would often tell me stories, that this is where she grew up. They had been born there in that home. All of her siblings, they had built this farm from the ground up, because at one point this land was considered something that wouldn't grow anything, right? It was considered a dead, quote unquote, dead land. And that's how they were able to get it for such an affordable price. And eventually they would lose everything trying to keep this land. And so eventually they would lose their land because they couldn't afford to pay the bank anymore, and the bank would come in and they would seize the farm. And they lost their farm, and the first thing they did was move back to Dallas, move to the city to find work. They moved to a 2-bedroom apartment. There was 10 of them at the time. And eventually, they lost that farm. That farm still today is now a park in Garland. It is a beautiful park, a conservation park. They have where they plant bluebonnets and wildflowers. And I used to really avoid the park, and I talk about it often because I was upset that this place that everybody can just traffic through without really knowing the history of what this land used to be to someone, not knowing that this was considered dead land at one point, and a Black family sat here and cultivated this earth, and now these bluebonnets are here and these wildflowers are here, and everyone's appreciating them without truly appreciating how it all became possible. And I do visit it now just because I know that this piece of land brought so much joy into her life. So I try to, I try to visit it just because I feel closer to her there. And, often too, when I think about conservation work as an environmentalist, most people don't think about, my great grandmother's farm and what that farm meant to them. And this is a picture of most of that family from back then. And they don't think about it in that way. All they see is someone who didn't pay bills, right? It's been a conversation I've had many times, but, it's a form of healing that they went through. And the story that happened in that land, I'm sitting here trying to share it to the best of my ability. The details that I was able to capture, this picture being one of them, I'll constantly share and I'll constantly talk about it. So boom. So my great grandmother, her name was Ma. I think I'm gonna just keep calling her Ma right now. She grew up believing that land was more than a commodity, right? It's not just something that you own. She grew up believing that land was this living and breathing thing. And as you can imagine, being an environmentalist, we think about abiotic and biotic, and just, we think of water and soil as these non-living things in the environment. She didn't. I grew up believing that water very much had life. It provided life and it was alive. Soil, it provided life and it was alive. But these aren't the narratives that are currently being carried out in my environmental classrooms right now, because they're not the narratives that are allowed to the forefront of these conversations, right? So eventually, this is why her garden, when she finally was, she married and she was able to buy a home, and this is the home, this is my childhood home. She was able to buy this home and she was able to create a garden there. And this garden was a very special place, not just for us, but for the community. And it really helped, and it healed people. And when I say it healed people, I'm talking about people thought this garden was magic, and it was magic in so many of its own ways, right? And she bought this house in Pleasant Grove. And there's this saying that says, ain't nothing more pleasant than the Grove. And I believe that to this day. And she believed it to this day, that Pleasant Grove is a beautiful place. I've grown up there my whole life. And I believe there are so many stories in Pleasant Grove, especially when it comes to the environment. And Pleasant Grove, it had a history of its own, right? The neighborhood where my great-grandparents had bought their home was just down the road from what is recognized today as the Trinity River Audubon Center. And before it was a nature preserve, it was one of the largest illegally operating landfills in the United States. And it was operating in a predominantly Black neighborhood, right down the street from an elementary school, right down the street from a park. And in the 90s, it caught on fire and it burned for weeks. And there's actually a documentary that you can just find on YouTube called Out of Deepwood that goes into more detail about this. But it was years before anybody did anything about this dump that just operated right down the street from Black families. And really, if you watch the documentary and you see the work that's being done out there, they took all this trash. So the trash is still there. That's very important. And they covered all of the trash with dirt. They have these huge methane tanks that sit out there that they used to release, the methane gas from the decomposing trash that now exists beneath the green rolling hills. So it's important to always know that that trash is still there. There was just so much of it, they couldn't clear it out. They were trying to find the most economic way to be able to do it. But my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-grandpa, they took a chance and they bought a house when the landfill was on fire because landowners were trying to sell their homes quickly. And she took a chance. She was like, we're never going to be able to afford a house again. Let's buy it. Let's see what happens. And they were able to get it and they were able to put out the fire, thank goodness, right? And so it was here that she was able to start that garden. And one thing they always used to tell me is during the move, when we were moving in, I was really young at the time, so I don't remember it. So I only have these narratives. She would tell me that there was a ton of ash and soot and smoke that would always rain down. And when we were actually moving in, we would have to use umbrellas and tarps to cover everything up while we were moving it into the house, just to keep it from getting destroyed. And also, another thing is, I had my first asthma attack right in that front yard. My mom and my doctor didn't even know I had asthma. But I had my very first asthma attack in that front yard. And then shortly after we moved in, my brother was also diagnosed with asthma. So just from jump, I was a sickly kid, y'all. I stayed sick. I stayed in and out of the hospital. And that meant I had to miss a lot of school. So when I would miss school, I would spend a lot of my days at home with my great-grandmother as she worked, and she reimagined her relationship with this new land that she had bought. And I got to witness her cultivate the dirt. I got to witness her feed the dirt. I got to witness her nurture the dirt. And often I was there helping her. And during our time together, the way she nurtured the earth, the way she cultivated the earth, the way she cared for it to heal it, she did the same thing for me. And it's kind of making me emotional thinking about it now. But the same effort that she put into building this garden, she put into raising me and into healing me in ways that I don't think even to this day I can truly express, right? And I could barely do for myself. And there would be some days, and I remember them vividly, where she would carry me out to this backyard garden that she was cultivating, and she would just sit with me in the dirt. If I was having a coughing spell, if I was having a temper tantrum, she would just sit with me out in the dirt. And it was one of the most healing things I think I've ever experienced. I don't know if anybody's ever just stuck your hands in the mud or just stuck your feet in the dirt when you're gardening. It's just a healing experience, and a feeling that washes over you that I don't think there's any words that can truly explain what it is. But I think we can agree that there is something there. It's just we don't know what it is. I don't know what to call it other than healing. And I remember putting my feet in the dirt and wiggling my toes around, like trying to eat the dirt as a kid, trying to feel the dirt on my face, trying to experience nature in this way. And if you think about it now, most kids, if you see a kid rolling around in the dirt, a lot of parents go and stop them, like, what are you doing? And not me. Like, I let my daughter play in the mud. I let her touch the mud. I let her, make a mess and she got to clean it up before she come in the house. But I let her experience it in that way because it's so important. And when I think about that, I think about how oftentimes these things, again, are not brought into the classroom. We can spend a whole semester learning about, ecology and never actually going out and experiencing the world in any kind of way. We just stay in the classroom because there's this one way to do it in college. There's this one way to do it and we stick to it and we don't venture outside of what we know, right? So that's something that I often think about. And also, like, right before my eyes, her garden at this time was just coming to life, like collard greens, mustard greens, tomatoes, cilantro, cacti. I grew up being able to just pick a tomato and eat it inside of Dallas, right? So that was something really big as well. One thing I truly loved, I loved about Ma was her voice. The lady could sing. She could sing. She could hum a melody. And she would often sing as she collected her big leafy greens. You know, she would sing as she collected the tomatoes because she felt like the plants needed the music. Now, nowadays, I do the same thing for my plants. It's getting ready to be time to start the seedlings. I don't play the same soul music she play. I love hip hop, so they're gonna hear a little bit of Common. They're gonna hear a little bit of Mos Def. My plants do. They're gonna hear a little bit of Jay-Z and Beyonce. And that's the kind of love she would put into cultivating her garden, right? She didn't use terms like biodiversity. She didn't use terms like ecosystem. She didn't use terms like balance and abiotic or biotic. You know, she never took, you know, an entomology course. You know, she never studied plant reproduction. She never studied soil chemistry. Yet here she stood entangled in it all. She did it all, but not in the ways that we understand it. And one story I always like to tell to this day is the story about the ladybug larva. When I was in her garden one day, I saw the ladybug larva sitting in her garden, and I went to knock it off of the leaf because, you know, I'm a kid, and I went to knock it off of the leaf, and she scrambled to save this larva and to put it back in its home. And she apologized on my behalf. And then she looked at me and she told me, everything has its place in my garden. Everything has its place here, including this ladybug larva. Like, you don't see it now, but it does have its place. And I'm sure she didn't understand the way we understand now about how insects are important for gardens, but she understood it in just as complex a way in her own way. Everything was connected, everything was interwoven in this intimate way, and that connectedness just was a part of our Black culture. Like, it was definitely a part of our Black culture. And when I say she went to that back garden to pray, to sing, to learn, this place became that for everybody that came through. So we would have family reunions back here. And our family reunions would be everybody sitting back there helping harvest. Nobody went home empty-handed. We would all be back there harvesting, music would be playing. You know, everybody's having fun, everybody's drinking, everybody's eating, everybody's harvesting to take stuff back home, to move stuff into the house. Sometimes we're picking things and we're still cooking, right? And so this was our conservation. This was how we conserved. This is how we interacted. So it's like during these family gatherings, right, with everyone assisting and everyone seating and everyone tilling, you know, we all ate together. And this was a form of healing that connected us to the land, and it connected us to one another, you know. And here we go. You know, however, you know, this is not always, you know, conservation. This is not the conservation that governs today's conversations, right? In fact, current conservation initiatives actively work to take Black communities, and not in all initiatives, but a lot of them work to take Black communities in the name of environmental progress, you know, ignoring the ways in which Black communities, like my great-grandmother's garden, have already worked to bring life to the land through cultural practices, beliefs, and actual physical labor, right? And through a Western lens, conservation work really centers the healing and restoration of land and land only, right? So this is John of the Mountains. That's what he likes to be called. That's what he was called. And he was considered to be this great ecological thinker. And his collection of books and essays and letters, you know, have served as these foundational tools for ecological classes. And they really center the preservation of the wilderness, right? And his work has led to the preservation of like what Yosemite Valley, Sequoia, you have the Sierra Club in, you know, California. And I know they recently posted about him. They recently came out exposing a lot of truths, but it's important to know that he gets a lot of praise in academia still. And a lot of academics really don't acknowledge the racist ideologies that fueled and inspired his conservation movement. You know, in his book, Our National Parks, he referred to indigenous people as dangerous and savage-like. You know, he called them, they were stains on the landscape. And that kind of reminds me of Amy Cooper. I don't know about y'all, as she yelled for help, calling Christopher Cooper dangerous, right? Telling the police she felt endangered. And these are kind of the ideologies that are still present. I went to a park here in Cooper Lake State Park, and upon entering the park, the park ranger tells me, he's like, hey, you got to get out of here by a certain time. Otherwise, a man comes around with a gun. Like, I don't know if that's how they always greet their guests in state parks, but these are the kind of things that we often get associated with. I've had the police called on me before for being in a park and digging somewhere, not a state park, but I was looking for fossils. at Ladonia here. It's a place where you can dig in this riverbed for fossils. And I've had the police come out and ask me what I was doing out there with a shovel. And I tell them digging for fossils, right? And it became a problem. But yeah, so these are the kind of things we have to think about, especially when we're talking about these great ecological thinkers. And in much of his work, he also called them, lazy. He called them deplorable. And, he failed to acknowledge how his own ideas, how his own theories were actually based on indigenous knowledge. This concept of protecting the earth has been foundational in indigenous cultures, right? But it's often absent in ecology classrooms and libraries, whereas John Muir's work, it's lining the shelves. I haven't had an ecology class yet come through this building that hasn't talked about John Muir. And then this is John Muir again. We got Roosevelt now. And, during the progressive era, it was a really big era for the conservation movement. The central priority became, we have to preserve natural features. We have to preserve regions, save the animals. And this caught the attention of Theodore Roosevelt, who really set out on this big adventure to save the land, save the birds, establishing a number of national parks, a number of bird reserves, a few game reserves. And this seems like an amazing feat, right? But Roosevelt's ideology really centered Muir's radical and racist stance. And that's a very dangerous thing. Often people don't think about, so now what do we have? So now we have researchers that are focusing on preserving the biodiversity of birds, insects, fish, and plants, but they're failing to actively preserve Black communities, Black culture, and Black ecological knowledge, those stories like my great-grandmother's garden, and this form of scholarship continues to be the sole environmental strategy that has been largely adopted within the United States, and it's been applied to numerous regions around the world. This form of healing and restoration of the land, that which Muir and Roosevelt pushed for in the early 1900s, has largely been at the expense of marginalized communities, right? Whose values and relationships with the land are wholly disregarded within academia and within conservation conversations. And this is an example. I'm in Denton, Texas. I'm at UNT. And this is an example of a community. It's known as Quakertown. And Quakertown was a Black community here in Denton. It was this thriving Black community. When some enslaved people were freed, they made their way to Denton, Texas. They put together all of their funds and they bought this piece of land and they decided to build on it. And they were very successful. They were a very happy community. Everybody had everything. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody had everyone's back. And then the colleges moved in. We have UNT and we have TWU that moved into the area. And, the leaders at the time thought, what would look good, what we should add to our city? We should add a park, a beautiful park for the wildlife. And you know where we should put it? We should put it right on top of Quakertown. So what happened was they ended up buying out the land. So they started citing them they passed laws. That's how it always happens. First, laws were passed. Your house had to be in a certain condition. Your house had to look a certain way. It had to be appealing to the eye. And when these individuals couldn't afford to meet those standards, they were getting cited. They were getting fined. And then it became exhausting. And it got to the point where they were like, I might as well just sell. So they were selling this land for little to nothing. And Denton was relocating these individuals to another part of Denton where we still have the descendants of Quakertown residents living there, still fighting for their land. The land that they gave them, now they're trying to take it back and rezone it to make apartments so that, because Denton's population is growing. So they're still fighting to just be able to exist in these spaces. But yeah, so there's a beautiful park there now, a beautiful park with native wildlife, a big center. And these people have been displaced. So recently, a few years ago, Denton, wanted to see what they could do to make up for this. So they say, I figured out what we'll do. We'll call this Quakertown Park. And that's all they did. That was it. Because they believe that the park shouldn't be uprooted, that the land shouldn't be given back to people because they know what's best for the land. And that's kind of how it was treated at the town hall meeting. And these descendants are still fighting for their right to that property that belonged to their ancestors, right? When we sit at the table and we go into discussing, environmental degradation, nobody wants to hear this story about my great-grandmother's garden. Nobody wants to hear about how, this is my first classroom where I learned about insects, that I've learned about insects differently. I learned how to communicate with insects differently. When I went into my first entomology class, and I found out that we were going to be catching and killing and pinning insects, I was disturbed from jump. I was very uncomfortable. And even though I communicated this to the professor, I was ignored and was told that it was a part of the course and that I must do it or I would fail. I offered to photograph pictures of the insects. I offered to bring my journal in. None of it was acceptable. I needed to be able to kill these insects and bring them in no matter the insect. And I couldn't believe in that. And it got to the point where, I guess if I were to put this in simpler terms, the ideologies that, were implanted in me from my culture and from my experience growing up in my great-grandmother's garden, there's no space for them here. There's no space for them in academia. My way of connecting with the earth, I'm often torn here. I'm between two worlds here. I'm doing what I think is expected of me from academia, while also trying to honor my roots and trying to honor my culture and trying to honor my great-grandmother in ways that are meaningful. So I often think about that. And one other thing that really, really gets to me nowadays, especially, and it was a conversation that I had earlier today too about monarch butterflies. And the conversation of monarch butterflies came up shortly after we were talking about the Black Lives Matter protest and what Abbott is doing here in Texas and things like that related to Black Lives Matter. And people were like, well, shouldn't all lives matter? And that's often the comment that follows that. And I'm like, well, shouldn't all butterfly lives matter, right? And so it's gotten to a point, and just to put it in simpler terms, where the monarch butterfly has now become a symbol of hope and healing, this thing that we must save, right? And I love monarch butterflies, while at the same time and simultaneously, the Black life has become targeted and eliminated. Often people talk about the Black life as though it's insignificant, while, wanting to preserve the monarch. And, rarely does conservation work aim to acknowledge the ways in which Black communities heal with the land and through the land. These Black narratives about survival, healing, and restoring the spirit through environmental stewardship are absent from the environmental discourse. But these counter narratives are powerful things. They are powerful, they're these opportunities to be able to share these experiences that actually make a difference. And if my entomologist professor had been in a position to had been willing to put himself in a position to listen to me and to hear me, I often think about what could we open up in this entomology class? What could happen if we stop saying there's only one way to do entomology? We have to kill the insects and out to look at it and observe it. Like you don't have enough cockroaches in your entomology collection already here at the university. There's plenty. But they aren't considered. And I really love this picture of my great grandma. So moving on to this and just thinking about it holistically, it's that what if? What if these narratives, like the one, I made earlier about being in the college classroom, what if that had been heard? What if these narratives were in the classroom with students? What if we talked about conservation, restoration, and healing through a more diverse lens? What if a space within academia was created where we could all sing and heal in my great-grandmother's garden, right? What if Black life, mattered, and I could safely enter a space without being asked what my life has to do with the science that I'm doing? What could conservation look like? What could it be? What could we imagine it being? And that's the question that I'm honestly going to leave you with, because I imagine it often. Sometimes I have days of hopelessness where I think, well, it could never come. And then I see a light at the end of the tunnel. And then I hear something about someone singing. Then I run into someone that tells me, hey, I remember you in the great-grandmother's garden. Or I go back to her old home that my family lost because of taxes. They didn't pay the taxes. And I see the remnants of her garden there. Or I visit that land in Garland that used to be her pig farm when they had, and I sit there and imagine, what could this be? What could this be? And I turn inwards to my work, because I don't know if you know this, I wanted to be a camera trapper. I loved camera trapping. My first bit of research was in camera trapping. I had no intention to ever go into environmental science. I had no intention to ever study Black ecological knowledge and collect narratives, or to study the disparities in access to nature. I love camera trapping. I love mammalogy. But then I'm begged the question of, well, somebody has to do it. Somebody has to collect these stories and keep them safe. Somebody has to talk about these disparities. And I know there are so many people still doing it, but there's so many more doing mammology, right? And somebody has to enter a space. And that's what I did often because my wife is also in the same Black studies. Often we're in these positions, not because this was my dream job or because, I was really excited and said, this is what I want to do. It's because I recognize that there is a need and somebody has to do it. Because no, if you don't, then who will? Who will collect the Black narratives in Pleasant Grove? Not me. Who will tell my great grandmother's story? And there's so many like her, if not me. And so that's where a lot of my work centers. And that's what I often tell people within their research. Look for these stories. Look for these people in the work that you do. Look to the communities. Before you start a research project, there's always these grassroots organizations. Look to the community. Connect with the community. Because these communities are not there for you to extract knowledge from so that you can get your publication. These are communities that mean something to people, and it could really change the way we do science if we think more holistically about our methodologies, about our relationships, about the narratives. Thank you.
Oh man, all right, Krystal. I have some stuff I want to talk to you about. I got some questions, all right? So you're
All
ready to
right,
answer some questions?
I'm ready.
All right. So all right, so this is very important to me too, because you resonated in certain things that you said. I'm a birder. Me and my wife, we go out and we do bird watching, and we also do herpetology. And we go out into the woods. And one thing, let me answer my friend Tim's question. All right, Tim Bryce is in the questions, and he was asking if I was going to do lights out birds again. Yes, I'm gonna do lights out birds. It's when we go around and collect the birds in downtown Dallas in an effort to figure out who's running into a building, birds flying into a building during migration season. We do that with Texas Conservation Alliance. But I'll bring that back around to your work at the Audubon in a minute, at the Audubon Center. But you said that somebody came and they asked you when you were out at the park, what are you doing there, or you have to leave at night. I won't go out by myself to go birding anymore. Like it's just not safe. It's an interesting world that we live in. When my friends go out and they do it all the time. They can go out. My white friends can go out and they can bird and they can herp. It is not a situation. But when I go out and do the same things, I get views from people who are walking around looking at me. Because you see a Black man in the dirt looking around, looking at insects and looking at bugs and looking at birds. And you don't, I could tell you the same thing that a white guy would tell you, and you might be a little more put off. But the work that you do at the Audubon Center, it said that you led hikes and things like this. Do you do any work with inner city kids, like the kids around that Pleasant Grove area, involving the Audubon Center over there?
Currently, no. Pre-COVID, they had different administration and different workers that are staff that I worked with. And after COVID, they were all laid off. So since then, I have not been back to the Audubon since before COVID, but I want to, as soon as I finish this degree.
All right, I'll be there with you. I'll come visit. All right, I do have another question. Well, a statement about your grandmother. That's awesome. She was teaching you about all kinds of indicator species and things without even having to use the fancy words about it. Like that story right there, is a great story, because in the Black community, a lot of us don't have stories like that, because like I can tell you a lot about some of my relatives, like, because it's not a connection. Like sometimes families get fractured. But the part about where you and your family owned that land, and it was the land being taken away, a lot of times when people come to these areas, speaking of biodiversity, they look beautiful or are prospering. It's not just because of the life that's there, it's because of the people who are there also. Like when you spoke of the indigenous people who lived in those areas. And
Exactly.
I'm a big proponent of that. Now, I know that last year you came to our homeschool day here at the zoo. And what kind of, so you work with children a lot, and what kind of work do you do with kids?
Currently, under my mentor, we teach children about water conservation in Dallas. So that's what we do. We go around, we teach, we go to events, we go into schools, We go into neighborhoods and we teach kids about saving water. And honestly, this is something that really got me into my research when I first started, because I noticed that she wasn't going to schools in Black neighborhoods. And I was thinking, kids in Black neighborhoods, they want to learn how to save water too, just in a different way, to get this knowledge. Because a lot of the time, I don't know about anybody growing up, but when I was growing up, my mama had already told me to turn the water off when I was brushing my teeth, because I wasn't paying nobody water bill. And it's a different kind of way of, thinking about it. And she told me, this is from, these neighborhoods weren't interested. These teachers weren't reaching out. They weren't interested. And I'm like, that's not correct. They're not interested in what you have to show, but there's different ways to teach conservation, especially the Black students. Think about it. If you show them a butter dish and you ask them to read, what is this butter dish? They're gonna tell you some other things other than a butter dish. That's a bowl. I was like, that could be a cup. That could be anything, and that can be interwoven into water conservation. So when we talk about water conservation, I often include these narratives. I sneak them in there. Talk about the ways in which Black households, especially my own, and what I've heard in narratives I collected, how we save water, how we recycle, and how we do those kind of things. So that's currently what we do right now across Dallas.
That's really awesome, because I'm up here at the zoo. I'm in Oak Cliff. It's right here in the area, and the demographic is a lot of Black people around here. And when they come to the zoo, and I'm teaching them about conservation, just like you're talking about the water conservation. Because last week we had David Buggs on, and he wasn't talking. He said that the world isn't like their world. It's not, it's not this person's planet. That's not this person's water. No, it's all our water. Like, the planet doesn't care. I'm saying, it's all our job to help save this planet at this point, because of the damage that was done to it. And yeah, you can't do that without getting to these neighborhoods and talking to people who would not, whenever we give presentations about stuff like you're talking about, like as far as water conservation and things like that. A lot of time we're talking to people who are in an upper tier of socioeconomic areas, right? And so your work right there, I think, benefits a lot to the people who we have around here in this area right here. Another question, like something that you said, all right, you were talking about how when you were in your entomology class, how you think that by this point in time they have enough insects and enough insect knowledge that they wouldn't have to pull more insects and kill them, right?
Right.
Which is pretty funny, because that's the same thing. That there was a lady, I learned a story last week. I'm learning so much from talking to y'all. I learned a story last week that they were studying American buffalo, the bison, and the same situation. They were studying them, but they had to kill some of them, and it was creating trauma within the herds. And then it was just one lady. She was a minority. I'm not sure exactly what she was, but she said, why can't we just do these studies without killing them? Why can't we use fecal matter? Why can't we use these things? And then she was the first person to bring that up. After all those studies, all that work, she was the first one to bring that up. And it was from somebody from outside of the normal areas of conservation coming in to help. So there have to be people like you. Like you said, how this wasn't your initial path that you wanted to go on, right?
It wasn't.
But it needs the planet needs people like you. All right, they just need people like you. I have a question right here from Monica, and it says, what do you suggest groups like Defenders do to help ensure we bring diversity, especially Black perspectives, into our work? So what kind of suggestions? I know you were talking about the water. What do you have any other suggestions on how we can bring the Black perspective into our work?
Yeah, so I would suggest sharing Black narratives, and I see that they hire a lot of diversity, just from what I've seen on the website and everything, and having those people share their narratives, sharing what the environment means to them. That's something so small that can make such a huge impact. So that's one thing that I really love, and that I always encourage organizations to do, is push those narratives, those Black narratives.
Awesome. All right, let's continue on a little bit with that right there. My next situation, all right, so when I said you're gonna be my new best friend, I mean it, because we're both into going outdoors. You said I read in your bio, it says you like hiking and things like this. Could you share a little bit about some of the things you like to do in your free time? We learned about the things you do with your work, but what do you do in your free time? Like as a Black woman who likes to be in the woods, tell me what you like to do.
Man, I love fossil hunting. That's like top tier. I love fossil hunting. I love camping. I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I just learned how to swim a year ago. So now my favorite thing to do is to go hit a lake and swim. The summer is coming and I am ready. But yeah, those are some of my favorite things to do. What I spend a lot of my time doing when I'm not being a grad student.
A lot of people don't hear, like, sometimes people just don't hear our voices. Like that's a lot of times we don't get that representation. Like when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's not like we don't think other lives matter. No, that's not even the case. When we're talking about Black Lives Matter, it's mattering in the fact that we've been removed from history books. We've been removed and disenfranchised from so many different things that the youth of this day, our young people, even me, wouldn't even know the history, the long history that we have in this country, the things that we helped build. So when you bring up Black Lives Matter and things like that, a lot of people might think you're trying to be divisive, like your coworkers. You said, like if you say bring up Black Lives Matter, you said your coworkers sometimes get a little pushback, right? Like,
Right.
And how would you
Always.
deal with, like, how would you how would you tell somebody how to handle situations like that from your perspective? How would you handle it?
From my perspective, I'm still learning. I'm sitting in, like I said, I had a conversation with them just this morning, and it's a day-to-day thing, and it's very stressful. And I've come to the point where I'm just deciding that it's not my job to teach people that my life matters. It's just my job is to exist and do what I love doing and to push my work, and my work will speak for itself. Because some people have their minds already made up, and no amount of anything ever going to change that. So I've gotten to a point where I'm realizing I'm done exhausting myself. The internet is a vast place. I tell people to go learn now, like don't ask me anymore. I don't want to be your token Black person on your diversity committee in environmental science to just be performative. Information is available. I tell them, tell them to go look it up. Like, don't come looking to me for answers anymore, because it really is an exhausting thing.
I get it. I get it. Like, it's like, I understand, because it's not like you're Krystal, the Black conservationist. I mean, you're Krystal, you're a conservationist. And like, I feel like we have to qualify ourselves so much just to be in the same room, with
Exactly.
people. Like, and yeah, it does sometimes get exhausting having to qualify yourself so many times, like answering questions that other people won't answer. But at the same time, it's us. Sometimes it's we're the only people in the room. So it's a heavy burden sometimes. The heavy is the burden of the person who's in the room sometimes. Like I've been in a lot of situations, and I'm sure you have too. I'm certain that you've been in a lot of situations where you're the only Black person in the room. And it seems like at times it gets heavy, like you represent for a whole race while you're sitting there just trying to exist, Last week we talked a little bit about people just wanting to be seen. I just want to be seen as a person, as an equal. I'm not asking for anything more. Like, you know what I mean? We're not asking for more. I'm sure you're not asking for anything more. You just want a fair shot, and you want to be on an even playing field, because your exceptionality will speak for itself, And I appreciate your Black excellence. I'm reading about you, and I'm learning more about you, and I appreciate what you're doing. We have another question, so I want to make sure I get this question. Let's see if I have any more questions. Here goes one. Oh no, somebody was just clapping for you, because yeah, like we shouldn't have to like qualify living. It's Black lives do matter. And the fact that people would believe otherwise is outdated, and is like that. We need to do away with that scenario that Black people speaking up for themselves is a wrong or a divisive thing. And I thank you for putting that out there. I thank you for being a representative, because you are still a representative. Just by being you, you're a representative. And I know that the qualities and the moralities that your grandma instilled inside of you shine through. And so wherever you go, whether it be in the woods, in the mountains, swimming in the lake somewhere, you will exude Black excellence. And I thank you for that. I thank you for your time. I thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so now I have to do a little bit of house cleaning and talk about some of the our next webinar time will be on the 22nd, and that will be a panel discussion, and we're gonna have all kinds of cool people. My friend Danae Jackson is gonna be on that panel, and she works here at the zoo. Another lady who exudes Black excellence. And we're just gonna have a good time still just talking about the things that us Black people feel as it pertains to the culture and conservation and things like that. So I thank you and I applaud you. And that's pretty much it for me. Do you have anybody have any more questions? Wait, I have another question. I don't want to get you off before you have a question. Nah, everybody just saying thank you for speaking. So
Thank y'all for
thank you,
having me.
Krystal.